There we go. Howdy, y'all. David needs a mic, I think, at the beginning. Appreciate y'all coming back for round 2 of this. My boss is here, so that's a little tricky. Dr. Wood. Hi, Randy. So I have to do really well. Let me start with just finishing that's a great way. Let me start by finishing the last lesson. So we did some context, right? So we said the Church of God, who are our neighbors, our brothers and sisters in Christ, our cousins, right, and whose headquarters is here in Cleveland. I learned a lot about them. I wrote a manuscript about Lee history, and you can't do Lee history without knowing the Church of God's history. And when David asked me to teach, I thought this would be a good opportunity for us to think about and learn about these neighbors that we have. And some of us here, right, come from Church of God and Pentecostal backgrounds. And so last time I did context, and I said Christian, right, Protestant, evangelical, holiness, Pentecostal. So we got through that much, and I didn't quite get to the end, so I'm just going to skip into that last question, fundamentalist. The fundamentals and fundamentalism, that idea, that term, comes from the early 20th century. So there's 2 parts of it. First part are, what are fundamentals? So the fact that somebody sat down and said, we need to define the fundamentals suggests that there was a challenge to these things within the church and within society. There were people in society saying, we're not sure about biblical authority, or that you can't have a virgin birth. That's, science tells us that's not possible. Or substitutionary atonement, or Christ's bodily resurrection, or the authenticity of miracles. So the fact that you have to sit down and write fundamentals, and there are a whole bunch of little tracts that were mailed out and people talked about, suggests that there was some threat to these ideas. And when I teach this sometimes to students, I teach one class about Christian traditions and church traditions and religious traditions in the United States. You go through those, and most of my students are evangelicals, and they're like, well, of course, right? But the fact that it's not of course is important. So in this sense, those Christian, Protestant, evangelical, right, holiness Pentecostals were fundamentalist, right, in that sense. They believed. And this, when you look at it, you would think most Christians do believe, but in the earliest 20th century, the church was starting to divide between, it's really not a division, it's a spectrum between modernist and fundamentalist with a bunch of people in the middle along different lines. And the modernists were said, well, our first and most really, I believe, your most reliable basis for truth is science. So science tells us, can virgins give birth? They cannot. Are there miracles? There are not. Can dead people come back to life after 3 days? They cannot. Right? Is a book of these things with these clearly not true things reliable? It is not. So on one side, on the left side, the modernists begin to argue, right, that the Bible's unreliable and that really Christianity is a set of ethics. It's not about faith for salvation, it's about ethics. The fundamentals are in part a response to that growing threat to these truths. And they said we need to publish these and make them true. So in that sense, the Pentecostals and the Church of God are fundamentalists. On the other hand, they're probably not fundamentalists. Most fundamentalists would not have embraced the Church of God. So it's again a little bit of that Venn diagram thing. And when I wrote my manuscript, one of the leading scholars of the Church of God and Pentecostalism, Dale Coulter, read part of the manuscript and immediately said, we need to talk. And he sat down and explained to me for like an hour and a half why I was wrong and that the Pentecostals had no association with fundamentalism. I think he's wrong. I think there's an overlap here. But there are things that take them outside of the fundamentalist camp as it develops in the 1920s. So in the 1920s, fundamentalism, not just the fundamentals, but fundamentalism takes shape as a reaction to modernism. So all the way over here on the right edge are the fundamentalists. And here's where, this picture, right? This is from our neighbors just down the street. Big anniversary going on this year. This is the Scopes trial over in Bryan, right? So where do they go astray? So things that the fundamentalists in the Church of God disagreed upon. One, holiness lifestyle, right, that was absolutely essential. Two, the question of ordination of women, which oddly enough still seems to be an issue in the church. For the Church of God, there was some fluidity at first, but they decided that women could be ordained essentially at the lowest level. They were called evangelists. You get an evangelist certificate. You couldn't do the Lord's Supper, you couldn't marry, you couldn't baptize, but you could preach, right? If the fundamentalist said, classic verse about women should do what in the church? Stay silent, right? The Pentecostals said, let's look at Joel where it says your daughters will prophesy, right? And that was so they're trying to balance those things. And of course, the second baptism, speaking in tongues. And then finally, I would say that the Church of God didn't engage in the culture wars. If you're going to be a fundamentalist, not just somebody that agrees with the fundamentals, but a fundamentalist in the 1920s, you're fighting the culture wars, and the Church of God really didn't engage in that. They went their own way. So I don't know. So if we're going through all these contexts, that's the last little bit of context. I would say they overlap, they're adjacent to, they touch. They may even hold hands occasionally, but they're not the same thing. Okay, there I'll stop for a second, because last time I said, at least in my case, usually after I've heard something, like an hour later, I'll think of a good question. So are there any questions for those of you here last week do you want to put to me about these contexts, these contextual things, before I push on?
I think, like, with the fundamentalist thing, like, of course I agree with the fundamentals.
Right.
I've always, like, felt uncomfortable with what has been described as fundamentalism. You know? And so I think that, like, even for us, we struggle with this terminology because it comes to mean something else, just like the word evangelical started to come to mean something other than what it originally meant.
Right, I agree completely. And the fundamentalists tended to, there's a whole, okay, I can't do this whole history. Fundamentalists developed sort of their own organizations, their own radio networks, their own presses, their own universities, all these things, and kind of created a very distinct identity that was the strongest between the 20s and early 50s. In the 50s, and I'll mention this later, the National Association of Evangelicals opens a bigger tent that more people enter in the 1950s, and fundamentalism starts to become sort of a narrow-minded, angry, legalistic sort of term. I remember when we were at Baylor, Leanne and I, not fundamentalists, we called them fundies. And that was not a good thing. You don't want to be a fundie, right? Because it had this, it was well past fundamentals. It was an older term that went along. Any other questions about context, about that stuff? Worked out? And so you can sort of place us, yourself, your own background, your own history within these sort of Christian contexts. Obviously, if we were doing, the Presbyterians, at a certain point this would diverge, right? And you'd be talking about Reformed traditions and then variations. The Presbyterians were ripped apart by the fundamentalist modernist moment. All right, Church of God then. So the Church of God, and we're still in its really early years, so we're talking about 1916, 17, 18, right in there, right? Had three institutions which were really the three pillars of what made the church work. One was the publishing house. That's a terrible picture. Huh. A terrible picture. If you're in the back, it looks great. If you're in the front, it's really pixelated. The publishing house was really important for the Church of God because it gave them the ability to write their own stuff, write their own books, their own pamphlets, their own music, eventually publish their own hymnal, the beloved Redback. So the publishing house is really important for a young denomination that doesn't want to have to rely on other people's press, other people's publishing. The second is the orphanage. They had an orphanage, and it still do have a variety of the orphanage. And the third was the Bible training school. So I'm going to use the BTS and Lee College to help illustrate some things happening in the church. But the Bible training school was founded in 1918. And this is interesting because it's right at the moment of the fundamentalist moment as well. And so part of what BTS was doing was the Bible training school was one of many such little schools that were formed. It's more like originally an intense Bible study retreat experience for students when they went in. But it's because the Church of God said we can't trust other people's schools. We really don't totally trust secular schools. We don't trust Methodist or Presbyterian schools, right? Or Methodist. We don't want to send our kids to Tennessee Wesleyan. We don't want to send them to Maryville, right? And Covenant, of course, wasn't even an option. But, right, what are we going to do? So they created their own little school, and that becomes the third piece of, right, the institutions upon which the Church of God are established. And I guess if I did a fourth, it would be sort of their administrative structure, but I really don't want to go too deep into that. Interestingly, right, the publishing house is essentially gone. The orphanage is largely gone. And one of the reasons Lee is really important today, because the Bible training school will become Lee College, and Lee College will become Lee University. It's one of those crown jewels in the Church of God's world, and because of that, people look at Lee a lot. The Church of God looks at Lee to see if we are holy, to see if we are Pentecostal, to see if we are in keeping, right, with the church's teachings. So these three things. I have lots of funny quotes. This is actually, if you're young, this would be like the recruiting letter you would get for the Bible training school back in the day. Are you planning to do more for Jesus? How little have you done for him who's done so much for you? No doubt you have longed for some way of getting better prepared for the work you feel the Lord would have you do. It may be preaching, missionary work, in the Sunday school, personal work, whatever it may be. The Church of God Bible School help you, yes, wonderfully. And I like the quote too, because this isn't liberal arts education. Right, this is very narrow, very specific. Why? Are you going to be a preacher? Are you going to be a missionary? Are you going to be on the mission field for your own personal Bible study? That's the focus, and that's very much the focus of the Church of God in the early days. They believed that Christ would come back soon in their generation. As a historian, that's terrible because they didn't keep records. They didn't keep anything. Because why would you, right? If Christ is going to come back any moment, why would you bother? And so their training was for very specific, like to go out into the field and harvest. Early on, the Church of God, and it's really interesting to look at a brand new denomination, because they're figuring stuff out. It's fluid, right? They're trying to answer some interesting questions. I talked about the role of women a little bit, but in the very earliest years of the Church of God, women were preaching. They were missionaries. One woman, Nora Chambers. Look, I have a pointer now. You can't see it on this screen. Oh, well, it's on the wall. Anyway, that woman in the top, that's really disappointing. It works on my whiteboard. In the top right, that's Nora Chambers. Her certificate she got said that she had been ordained and that she could do the Lord's Supper and baptize in Mary. But immediately, within 2 years, that same certificate, they were taking a Sharpie and sharpieing out those three things for women. And a couple years later, they just printed new certificates, right? They took those off for women. But it's interesting to watch, right, a new denomination figuring out some of these things. It's the Genesis. And another was a question of physical healing. When we look at, and we're going to look at the very end, the Declaration of Faith from 1948, it talks about healing, divine healing as being central to the Church of God. And in the very earliest years, they took that very seriously, as in no doctors. You don't go to a doctor. A doctor is a lack of faith. You go to the elders, you go to, right, the deacons, you go to the church leaders, they lay on hands and they pray for you. And that was really central in the moment that took this out of, right, a centerpiece of the Church of God was the influenza epidemic that took place in World War I. And if you know anything about epidemics, if you don't know about that one, you should look. It is devastating. It's worldwide. It's serious. And the Church of God, which believed in divine healing, decided to cancel its General Assembly in 1918 because they realized if we all get together for this, we're going to kill people. And it was that sort of moment that took, it's still in their Declaration of Faith, but it took it out of that central, never go to a doctor, right? Instead, as we believe, right, that God can heal, we believe in healing as a gift, but it doesn't mean that you can't go to a doctor to right, and that doctor can be the means of that. They also early on were pacifists, at least some of them were, serious pacifists. A.J. Tomlinson just said, you should not fight. War is evil, war is of the devil. Fighting then is, you're in league with Satan if you do that. And because the church began in 07, World War I starts in 14, we enter in 17, this is a real challenge for the church because you had these young men saying, I can't fight, and the United States government saying, what denomination are you from? Right, if you're a Mennonite, you could say that, or a Quaker, you could say that. There were long-established denominations that said, we're pacifists, and they would agree, but not Church of God. Some Church of God people went to jail. Some went and fought and served a non-combat role. Some went and served in combat. But this was an early critical piece that by World War II is gone. So in World War II, Church of God people fought and also served in non-combat, sort of roles. Again, this sort of getting things settled takes a while in a new denomination like this. And then there was the question of authority. Who? This is always a problem with churches and humans, right? Who runs things? Who has the final say in the church? How are structures built, right? What do those look like? And this will end up resulting in a major crisis for the Church of God in 1923 when they split, schism in 23. And it's about authority. So what happened was A.J. Tomlinson, there on the left, he consolidated power under himself. He was the publisher for the Church of God Press. He was in charge of the orphanage. He ran the school. And he was the general overseer of the Church of God, the top guy. And on top of that, he had all the churches send their money to the denomination, and he then redistributed it back to the churches. So all that power right under his, very able, I should say, leadership, but the church rebelled against that. Against his wishes, they took away the publishing house, away the orphanage, and eventually, I don't want to get into this. These are fighting words still among like some elements in the Church of God. They determined that he had mishandled money. And based on that charge, they removed him from leadership in the Church of God, and then he removed himself from the Church of God. I think, from what all I can see, is that he wasn't stealing money from the church. He was just not a great bookkeeper, right? Sister Jones would come, and she would there'd be a crisis, and he would like give her money and not always write it, and she wouldn't sign a receipt and hand it back. And we're not talking about a ton of money that was missing or mislaid, but it was gone. He would say, yeah, but I gave it to Sister Jones, and how do you track that? Anyway, he is removed from leadership. He removes himself from the Church of God. There's a long fight over who gets to be Church of God, and ultimately, there's the Church of God in technically Cleveland, Tennessee, and then there's the Church of God of Prophecy, so Kagop. So if you're wondering about that, because if you don't know, like there's two major denominations based in this town, the Church of God of Prophecy and the Church of God of Cleveland, Tennessee. This is the moment. Tomlinson took the group that's the Church of God of Prophecy, and they would still argue they are the real Church of God. They will establish institutions in parallel with the Church of God under Tomlinson's leadership. The Church of God then has to find a new leader. This is tough, right? This guy who really formed the denomination, the grandfather of Pentecostalism in the Southeast is gone. Who do you choose? And they chose a guy named F.J. Lee. Ultimately, he's the one we named Lee College and Lee University after. About every 3 years, I'll get some undergrad from Columbia or something, or grad student calling me and saying, so you're Dr. Coates? Yes. You're in the history department? Yes. Who is Lee named after? And they're certain they know, right? That would be Robert E. And I have to tell them, no, it's Flavius Josephus. And you can just hear it's like, sigh. Oh, that's okay, bye. I mean, it's over, right? The conversation ends. I don't even get to tell them who Flavius Josephus is. So Flavius Josephus Lee. And it's interesting, there are almost no good pictures of him. There are only like 3 or 4 pics of Flavius Josephus. Is this guy on the right. And he was hugely respected in the Church of God, but in part because he had been a Baptist until very recently. He had been a Baptist at First Baptist Church in Cleveland. He was a minor official within the church, right? He had really high standing, and he had an experience. And it's what the Pentecostals believe, he personally, he personified the Church of God experience. He and friends went downtown in Cleveland. Church of God was having one of their big tent meetings, sawdust on the floors, lots of fanning, lots of emotion, right? And people in town would come to watch these things as entertainment. So the Baptists and the Presbyterians and the Episcopals would come in and kind of look and watch from the back and make snide remarks and do things like you can imagine Presbyterians doing in this environment, right? And FJ's in the back doing this, having this experience, right, and talking. And then by his testimony, this is powerful testimony. Here's this established rock within First Baptist Church, said, I felt compelled to not just sit in the back, but to walk down the aisle in the sawdust, right, all the way to the altar. And he said, the Holy Spirit overcame me, and he falls to the ground, unmoving, for minutes. And when he's able to stand again, he speaks in tongues. And this is a strong testimony. He gave up a lot, right? This isn't a good rational idea for him to do this in this moment, to turn his back on the biggest, strongest church in town, right, First Baptist, and his position in the church, and his friends who are going to shun him as he walks down the aisle in the sawdust and falls down at the altar. Can you imagine, well, maybe Sam, but not Philip. I mean, you can't see Philip doing that, right? Imagine Philip walking up and then no way, right? And so, because of that, he's the perfect personification of the Pentecostal experience, right? Not that he wasn't saved as a Baptist, but he had that second baptism of the Holy Spirit. So F.J. Lee briefly becomes the Church of God General Overseer, and then dies without the assistance of medical professionals, probably from something he could have been healed from with the assistance of medical professionals. And so even better, he's almost kind of martyred early. He briefly, right, takes over. He's the namesake later of the college and the university. And so this is the split between Church of God of Prophecy and Church of God. I took way too long doing that. But it's important to know, right, because you see these churches, what's the difference and why can't they get back together? And there's long history. And probably the biggest single question is the issue of divorce, and how you handle divorced people is the biggest issue, the most intransigent issue within that sort of split between the two branches of the Church of God. All right. Lee history, but there's a reason for this. So Lee, back when it was Bible training school, right, they were here in Cleveland sort of under the thumb of the denomination. They shared facilities with the publishing house and with churches. But in 1938, they got this big moment. There was a little school up in Sevierville that had failed, and they were able to buy the campus, pennies on the dollar. Building, 63-acre campus. It's beautiful. It's still there. You can go up and see it. It later becomes the Church of God of Orphanage. And the school moves up to Sevierville. And at this moment, it's in the middle of the Great Depression, right? I mean, this is the worst economic moment for the United States, sustained over time. And you notice these years encompass World War II. The school grows like crazy during these years. In fact, the church also grows like crazy. And what you see is a shift from the first generation of Church of God people to the second generation. There's a generational move. The first generation were those Tomlinson and the people up there in Camp Creek and Drygo, right? Those hard, often really poor, hardworking, poorly educated people. That was the first generation that founded the denomination. The second generation, though, that comes up in this era, the church is doing better. As a matter of fact, they're doing a lot better. I have a couple of nice quotes here. Let me read one to you from General Overseer Jernigan. There's so many. Dr. Wood knows this. He likes quotes as well. It's hard when you can't read all your quotes. Here's Jernigan. This is in 1945. Some of our greatest churches, with their large brick buildings and well-furnished parsonages with plenty of money, were once a little handful of members pushed back into the alley or out to some isolated section of the suburbs of town, worshiping in some old dilapidated building. Sometimes we talk about getting back to where we once were, but really, I do not think that is what we want. And I doubt very seriously we had any more religion 20 or 30 years ago than we have now. The Church of God has come out from obscurity and isolation to declare her position in the world. We always had a great deal of boldness and confidence. Sometimes we might have demonstrated more zeal than we displayed knowledge, but we have been an honest, sincere, and hardworking band of people. We have moved to the front. And that's that new generation of leaders, right? They're saying, we are established, right? We have an identity and we've had success. The number of members is pouring into the Church of God. The amount of money is pouring to the Church of God. And boy, the Evangel, which is the Church of God publication, like monthly, there's a picture of a brick church on the front, right? A new church. And the very best ones are the ones like, we bought this from the Methodist, right? We took their church. And now look, we're on the front street. However, Jernigan, the next year, at General Assembly, this is where both these take place, this is the annual and now biannual event for the Church of God, wrote this, or said this. We are in danger of losing our evangelistic zeal by putting our trust and hope in the wealth of our congregations, in our fine church buildings, comfortable parsonages, salaries, luxuries of life, and such things that appeal to the lust of the eye and the pride of life. It would be easy to sell out to Satan, compromise with the world, and allow our hearts to become engrossed with pride. That's the same guy, right? I mean, he's like answering what he said the year before. And in part what's happening is, I forgot I had that. What's happening is that the Church of God has a little bit of an identity issue going on, right? Between the old and the new. Real quick, I'll do this real quick. So they're up in Sevierville. In 1947, the school, BTS, moves to Cleveland. And it moves to a campus. It's actually Lee University is the third school on the campus where we sit. The first one was Centenary Female College. That's a Methodist school for women. It went bankrupt in the Great Depression. It was bought out, that campus, by Bob Jones. Bob Jones College then was there. They left in 46 and sold the campus to BTS. But when BTS shows up and comes to Lee, they changed their name to Lee College in 1947. So this is when Lee comes back to Cleveland. Where the fountain and the administrative building is where this building used to sit. There's a little piece of centenary left, one wing of a building. There's a good bit of Bob Jones left up at the front of campus. So we're the third school there. But I note, right, when they come back, are they BTS? No, now they're Lee College. And this is another sign of like that shift of generations. Where that first generation said, why do you need to go to BTS? For hardcore, in-depth training? To be a preacher, to be a missionary, right? To be a Sunday school teacher. Very narrow, very intense experience. Now, after the war, that same congregation, right, the Church of God is saying, in our new, it's hard, they're not wealthy. This is the prosperity of people that were able to now work 40-hour weeks with 2 weeks paid vacation, right, and have some sort of pension. But we want our kids to go to college, but not to UTK, right? We want our kids to go to a college and get a liberal arts education, perhaps, or a Bible school education, but more than what BTS offered. BTS offered short-term and at one time 2-year sorts of degrees, or you could study music there, or you could study secretarial work. But they said, we want to be like a real school. All this reflects what starts to become a consistent sort of fight within the Church of God, which you may get echoes of. For all of us at Lee, it's more than an echo. It's more like sometimes a loud backfire, right, in your garage, or when you set the alarm off, the panic button. It's kind of like that sometimes, between the progressives and the traditionalists. So the first generation, they were only traditionalists. This new generation, though, you start to see people that, and this is true of any enterprise. Randy's a scholar of the Puritans. When the Puritans come to the United States, right, they're all in. They've left everything. Their kids are mostly in. Their grandkids, they've been living in Boston. They didn't give up anything. Things are comfortable. And the Church of God experience, and listen a little bit of that as well, as new generations come in, they don't have that same zeal, that outsider status, that dedication to hardcore holiness. And these two men are sort of two interesting pieces of that in the moment. One is Zeno Tharp. I put him on the right for a reason. He's the traditionalist. Zeno is a hard man, and he is a serious holiness man. He believes, in fact, he fought hard to say Lee College should be just called the Church of God College, right? He's very specific, different, called out. And I know you think I chose that picture just because he looks belligerent. He always looks like that. That's Zeno Tharp. And so he's from South Carolina, and Zeno Tharp is like a dedicated traditionalists. We need to hold fast to the way our parents did things, while also enjoying nicer suits and a nicer house and a nicer place. The other guy I have up is J. Stewart Brinsfield. And Brinsfield was a progressive. Now, I say these two words, don't think progressive and traditionalist in 2025. Think about it in the Church of God in 1945. Brinsfield is a hardcore, very conservative, holiness Pentecostal. He's only progressive if you happen to be in 1950 in the Church of God, right? So if that's the modernist and that's the fundamentalist, Brinsfield's kind of over here, right? But he's considered progressive within the Church of God. And these two guys went back and forth. Brinsfield was, you almost tell by just kind of the way they look, right? Brinsfield believes that we should be holiness, but it should be more positive and less negative, less rule-bound. That's a good story, but I won't tell it. And Tharp sees him as a threat, right? He is a danger to not just the church and holiness, but to people's souls, right? That he's weakening the holiness stance. And ultimately, Brinsfield, Zeno Tharp was president of the college, as was Brinsfield. That's the dates. You see they're pretty close to each other. Tharp, as a leader of the church, will force Brinsfield out of the presidency at Lee and ultimately force him out of the church. And that sort of fight was constant in the Church of God, right? How do you know, right? How do you know what's holy enough? What traditions do you hold really fast to? Like going to a basketball game. This is one of Brinsfield's sins, is he didn't punish Lee students for going to basketball games. Like that got out, and the traditionalists like, oh my God, right? I mean, it's all over. The story is these kids were called in front of Brinsfield, and he asked them, he said, I've heard you were at a basketball game at Bradley Central's gym. And they looked at him and said, no, sir, we were not. And he looked at him and he said, gentlemen, you're sure you were not at this basketball game in the gym? And they said, we are not. He thought about it. He said, were you at the basketball game in this other place? And they're like, yes, sir, we were. And he just, right? And instead of like giving them 99 demerits, right to the edge, he just started laughing and let them go. But that got him in trouble. And ultimately, he's going to be kicked out of the presidency and out of the church. And this fight is real, and it's important for the Church of God in the 40s, about holiness standards. I have, let me see if I'm going to go back. Like these women, like, look, you can look at her sleeves pushed up a little bit. You can see their skirts are right down to now mid-calf. These are all questions they really worried about, like how people dressed and what they did at the college. Ultimately, let me hold that thought. I meant to print these out for you, but I didn't. I'll read them. You can look them up on your phone, the Declaration of Faith. Ultimately, these holiness questions, practical commitments, how you live, combined with some theological arguments, especially about sanctification. If you're here last time, you remember this question, can be totally sanctified, like instantly freed from original sin, or is like sanctification this lifelong process of becoming more Christ-like, but never being free of sin? These questions cause the Church of God to do, well, I think it's kind of funny in some ways, but to do the unthinkable, and that is to write a declaration of faith. You're like, it's a bunch of Presbyterians. You're like, well, of course you did. And then you made it a longer one and a shorter one, and then you made footnotes to the longer one, and then you did a catechism, and then the shorter catechism, and then, it goes on. But for the Church of God, even doing this was a huge thing. Writing down in a formal statement what you believe. Now, why do you do that? Well, you do that because, there's slippage at the edges. You do that because there are people that are questioning things that you thought were established from tradition. So if you want to pull these up, you can pull them up on your phone. It's easy. It's the Declaration of Faith. I put 1948 because that's the General Assembly in which they were adopted. They are unchanged. So it's the same Declaration of Faith today, 2025, as it was in 1948. Time.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
When did they change their perspective that the world was ending any day? Or did they?
You know what? I'm going to wait and do this next time. I'm going to put that away. The question is, when did they switch from that deep belief in the immediate return of Christ. And I would say after the first generation. I would say in the heart, right? It's still in the lips. You see that even today. You can see that, right, written. I think in the 50s, 60s, 70s, they talked about it. But I think after the first generation, that belief, not that you just said it, right? Christ can come anytime. We all know this, right? Like a thief in the night at any moment. I'm sorry. For all of y'all of an age, you know what I'm thinking about, brothers, right? Leanne and I had this moment where we don't do it, but there's this movie called A Thief in the Night. Have you seen this? We went back and watched part of it in Texas, and it was, anyway. So Christ, sorry, I slipped. Christ can come back at any time, right? But that first generation really believed it. They thought any moment. We got to get in the mission field. We got to go now, any moment. After that, though, it's interesting. It's like the school starts keeping records in the 40s. Suddenly, right, you start getting people keeping stuff and like recording history, and it gets better. And that's a sign of that belief that Christ, of course, any moment, right? That intellectual assent, but not that deep belief that it could happen at any moment. That's a good question. I'm just going to, I got 5 minutes. So questions? Yeah.
You said that the big difference between Church of God and of prophecy is how they handle divorce.
Right.
Without explaining how they handle divorce.
Can divorced people remarry? Can they serve in church offices?
So
The Church of God prophecy is more conservative on that than the Church of God. Yeah.
What is the connection between the Church of God and the holiness churches that we see today?
Yeah, and that's interesting, right? So remember when we talked about holiness, were you here last week?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so when we talk about holiness, it never goes away, right? So it's old. It goes all the way back into the early 19th century and the First Great Awakening. It's still around today, but the question is, how do you define what holiness is? And we actually sang about it today, right? I mean, it was in the confession. We talked about being separate, right? Today. I mean, it's not that we don't believe we're a holiness church to some extent. We should not be just like the world. We should be set apart. God sets us apart. But how do you operationalize that? So holiness churches that tend to identify themselves that way will have a set of do's and don'ts usually, right? You absolutely should not do these things. And Church of God's still, right? No alcohol, no tobacco, or to the big do nots today still. So those are, you must abstain from these things. But oftentimes the list gets considerably longer. Yeah. Yes?
The question of women in the church, you mentioned that Dora Chambers was allowed to preach in this thing, and then that was taken away.
Still preach. No, they can still absolutely preach. You can be an evangelist and preach, but you can't have authority, right, in a local body. You can't baptize. You can't do communion, and you still can't, well, now you can. You can vote at the General Assembly, but you can't be a pastor, essentially. So today, the younger generation is pushing back hard against those limits on women in the ministry. The older generation is holding fast. This should all sound fairly familiar. But yeah, so they don't take away that ability to preach. So
But there are some women pastors now. So
often, I mean, the way you get out from that is that you put them under the coverage of a senior pastor in some way. So that's how you get some, like they're not the actual head of the thing. They're under it. It might be, right, satellite church sort of thing, where you're still under the head of a senior pastor. That going about that way. You see a lot of husband and wife teams in the Church of God like that as well. Yeah. Yes.
May I say that
Yeah.
there is a lot of slippage in that.
Yes.
Yeah, but specifically, they had divided up into regions, or so you had the term was in my mind, but it's left me now. But yeah, because I was in the Church of God from the early 50s.
She had bishops over, they call them states, but a state can be northern Georgia or southern Georgia. But
Even smaller, district.
District, okay, yeah.
I'm trying to say that.
Districts.
And so, yeah, the women oftentimes did serve as pastors, and even there was a lot of slippage when it came to marriages.
Yeah, it's, the Church of God's control over local congregations is more Baptistic than it is Presbyterian. Put it that way. Any other thoughts? I guess we'll.
How big is the Church of God population-wise?
800,000 in the United States and another 11 million worldwide. So huge worldwide, twice the size of PCA in the United States. But you wouldn't know that if you lived in Cleveland. You would think it was much, much bigger. Yes.
How is Church of God Anderson?
Completely different, oddly enough. I didn't, okay, to be fair, I was in Texas, right? I'm in Illinois teaching. When I saw the ad for the Church of God school, this Lee University, I didn't know what the Church of God was. The only one I'd ever heard of was Anderson, Indiana, which it turns out is a completely different thing. Not Pentecostal, fundamentalist, conservative, sort of Baptistic. That's the Church of God of Anderson. And so I had to look it up, and then I had to figure out that really quickly, was it Church of God of Prophecy or Jerusalem Acres of North Carolina, of Cleveland? There's several different varieties. Anyway, so yeah, there's a number of churches that claim that name.
Where are the 11 million primarily?
South America, Africa, that's West Africa, and Korea are the biggest locations for Church of God.
Is the emphasis toward a sort of a Christian worldwide view and so forth, that Lee, embraced by Church of God denomination, or is it something that they look at with some suspicion?
The Church of God today, I would argue, there's a traditionalist wing that is very suspicious of everything that happens at Lee. There is a progressive wing, both these, say, 20, 30%, that thinks that we're way too conservative, which is interesting. And I think the bulk of the church is pretty content with what Lee does. It's just that the margins, as we know in society, are a lot louder than the middle, right? They're mobilized, they're on social media, they're much more aggressive than the sort of center mass. All right, I'll stop there. We'll come back with the declaration. That's probably all we'll do is the declaration of faith next time. And I'll try to wrap things up. Thank you all. Let me pray. Lord, thank you for being good to us. Thank you for our brothers and sisters in Christ. And as we understand them, to also understand ourselves and where we stand better in our own backgrounds. I pray, Lord, that we would be good neighbors to them and that you would bless us as we seek to be generous, but also to hold fast to our own peculiarities. In Christ's name, amen.